So at the close of summer, I was thinking a lot about summers and experiences I've had in the summer. And when I was in college, I led wilderness canoe trips in the Boundary Waters canoe area of Minnesota for a camp called Camp Widgiewagon. And I got paid $90 a week, 90 per week. I was psyched, $900 I was gonna go with home at the end of the summer. And I got to be in the woods with kids canoeing. And there's a lot of great stories about that, but tonight I wanna focus on a trip that I had to take, because if you had a day off in between groups of campers that would come for a session that lasted like a week or 2 weeks long, if you had a few days off, you had to work to make your $18 or $19 or $16, whatever the math is for that day. And so we had to work part of the day like doing maintenance, repair. And for some reason they decided to give me the project of going up to Canada and picking up one of the advanced groups. I had a couple days off in between things, and that was the way I was going to make my money. So they asked me to drive to Canada in a 15-passenger van to pick up a canoe group that was coming off of a 45-day trip to the Arctic Circle. And so I was psyched because I was going to get to go on an adventure, and I was getting a paid vacation, pretty much $19 a day. And they had petty cash. If you remember, it came in a metal box, and they opened up the metal box, and they gave me cash to pay for gas and even my own meals. I was so excited. But then they assigned me Dan, who was the least likable camp counselor and most useless person at the entire camp to go with me. I tried to resist, but they insisted that Dan accompanies me. And the second we got into the van, he went into the very back of the 15-passenger van and promptly fell asleep. So I drove to the Canadian border. This is my first time crossing the border by myself, I'm pretty sure at this point. I'm 19 years old. And I've got this van with a canoe trailer behind it that's empty to load up all the canoes once I get everybody. And the Canadian Customs, which I expected would be really friendly and super intelligent and awesome, turned out to not be that. And so I got there and they asked me a zillion questions. Where am I going? What am I doing? They were really perplexed by this empty canoe trailer. And I tried to explain, I'm from a YMCA camp, and there was a big YMCA camp decal on the side of the van. So, but there was a new trainee that working that day, and he really wanted to bust somebody. And I was the guy that he really wanted to bust. So he pulled me out. They went through the van. There wasn't really much in there. And then they found Dan in the back sleeping. They're like, what about this guy? I'm like, oh, I forgot about him. He's totally useless. Don't worry about him. And they went through like my flashlight, battery compartment, and every little thing. And this guy kept saying, I know he's got something in here. I know we're going to find it. And eventually he asked me to empty my pockets. So I reached my hand in my pockets, and mostly just a bunch of like random wrappers of things. And but there was a small piece of white tissue paper with antihistamine, like over-the-counter antihistamine that somebody gave me because I had allergies, pollen allergies, and they compressed into a white powder. And so I pulled out this thing and said, oh no. And he saw it, and he opens it up, and he's like, aha, we've got him. And so I tried to interject. He was having an alarm bells go off, and he called over his supervisor, and I was like, it's a decongestant. I'm working for a YMCA camp, I'm not doing drugs. And if I had him, I wouldn't put him in a white tissue paper and let it rot in my pocket for 3 weeks. And so eventually the supervisor realized this was nonsense and just sent us on our way. But I asked the supervisor, hey, I'm gonna be picking up this group of people on a 45-day expedition, and they have a serious medical kit. Like, it's not just decongestant here. There's all kinds of prescription medicines, epinephrine injection shots, all kinds of stuff in this big med kit. What do we do when we come back? Because we're going to be coming back, and how is the U.S. Customs going to be? And the Canadian officer said, well, they're like us, only like 100 times worse. So I was like, oh, that's great. So I left. I drove hours and hours. I figured where I was going in Canada that I was meeting, and hours of driving. Dan went right back to sleep. And I got to the group. They were delayed. There was no cell phones. I just had to kind of wait at the pickup place for hours until they finally showed up. And we loaded up 10 of the stinkiest high school students you can ever imagine into the van, and the 2 leaders, Kristen and Mojo. And it was probably by this point like 11 o'clock at night, and we figured we'll be at customs at like 1 or 2 in the morning, going back to U.S. Customs. So we got some food, we started driving, and on the way back, I told Mojo and Kristen about my trip into Canada and how hard it had been, and I was worried, like, what about our med kit? And if we get searched and they find this med kit, yes, the YMCA has a doctor's note and prescription for all this medicine, but probably not with us. So we could be here all night waiting around for the YMCA to open, and I'm sure it'll all get taken care of, but do we really have to spend the night in U.S. Customs? So we talked about it as we were driving down the highway, and Mojo said, you know what, it's just not worth it. I'm so exhausted. I've been out for 45 days with these guys, and like, let's just get rid of the med kit. So he rolled down the window and started ditching penicillin here, codeine there, epinephrine syringes here. Bad to admit, 19-year-old brain is not always thinking so clearly. But we were like, rather just be gone with than have us deal with it. So we pulled up into, and Mojo turned and asked the students. He said, listen, I figure I probably know after 45 days, but if anybody has any joint you're holding on to or anything you were waiting to, have as a celebration getting back, you got to tell me now because we're about to go through U.S. Customs and I don't want to hear about it later. And they're all like, no, we're all good. So we pulled into U.S. Customs at like 1:32 in the morning, and customs agent asked the usual questions. I'm like, hey, we're with the YMCA group, and we are just coming back from this trip. And he said, okay, he asked for everybody's driver's license or like the permission slips from the YMCA, looked at all that stuff, and he said, what's with all the gear in the back? And then Mojo, who had been kind of in the shadow of the passenger seat, leans forward, and Mojo had hair down to the middle of his back and a scraggly, wild beard, and he was really thin with big eyes, and he just kind of looked in the shadow, like, unveiled his face, and he said, look, man, we're coming back from 45 days in the wilderness, we're just trying to get home, that's just all of our canoe gear. And then the agent just looked at him and said, everybody inside. So we left the van exactly where it was. We usually have to pull somewhere, but they just said, keep it there, everybody in. We went inside. Mojo saw there was coffee on the coffee pot and this big thing they took us. He's like, can I have some coffee? And they were not very happy about his request. They asked us all to empty all of our pockets while they sent one agent out to scour the van and search everything. And Mojo said, listen, man, we're a YMCA group. These are kids in a program. Like, we're just going home. Is this really necessary? And then they just said, you, in the back room, take off all your clothes. And they put him in the back room with some other agent, and then all of us started to unpack our pockets. And you can imagine it was like high school kids. It was like Starburst wrappers and like old, crap from this 45-day trip coming out, nothing important. And all of a sudden, the agent looked over at one kid who was wearing cargo pants, and he had those big side pockets. And he reached his hand and said, hey, you gotta empty all your pockets, those side pockets too. He reached his hand into the side pockets, and I saw this look of horror come over his face. And the agent didn't see it, but I saw it, and I was like, no. And he put his hand and he pulled out a small plastic baggie filled with green, powdery substance. And I started laughing. I tried to hold it back so no one would hear, because I knew immediately what this was, and it looked really bad, but it was actually dried spinach, which is one of the highlight meals of this camp was alpine spaghetti, where you made spaghetti and you put dried spinach, almost like pesto, but not as good. And you put that in there with a bunch of Parmesan cheese and you ate that. So I knew that's what it was, but it looked like a bag full of pot. As soon as the agent saw it, it was like DEFCON 5 alarm started going off. He's like, we got him! Look at this! And they started ringing bells and there were so many agents at like 2 in the morning that came out of the woodworks freaking out. And I was trying to interject that it was just spinach, but it took a while to get them to calm down. And so I explained, it's just spinach. And if you give me some hot water, I can actually hydrate it and show you. You can taste it and see. And so they were not buying it at first, but then one of the supervisors realized that's probably a pretty good explanation. Maybe we should check into this. So meanwhile, Mojo came out from his private room screening with nothing. He had nothing on him, literally. And then he came out, and they said, okay, we buy spinach. You guys smelled it, tasted it, but we're still going to take apart those 15 Duluth packs that are in the back of your van, of the canoes. And Mojo just looked at them and said, that's fine. We're just going to curl up here and take a little nap on your floor. Just know that you're going to be sorting through 45 days of teenage underwear, lots of pots and pans that haven't been cleaned sanitarily in any kind of proper manner for the last 45 days. But you have at it, and we'll just wait here until you're done. So then they all went off and huddled together and talked. And the guy who went outside and looked through the screen, he went and came back with nothing to report except for he hadn't been through all the Duluth packs. So they talked about it for a while, and then they finally said, okay, you can just go ahead, just get out of here, please, go. So we drove back, got into camp, in the middle of the morning, fell asleep, and the next day I woke up and sat down at the breakfast table, excited to have made my, $18, $19 a day, and deliver everybody safely back to the camp. And the camp director came over and put his hand on my shoulder, and Dan was sitting down the table, and he's like, "You guys, thanks so much for driving those guys back from Canada, getting everybody home safely." And I was about to respond, "You're welcome," and Dan spoke up and said, "Oh, don't worry about it, it was nothing." He didn't drive 1 minute. Yeah.